Hello, and welcome to Social Workers Rise, where we inspire social workers to connect, expand their knowledge, and change more lives than they ever thought possible. We will talk everything social work on every level from micro to macro. We are going to hear stories of social workers who are doing big things, learn new skills, and most importantly, give you actionable steps to make a difference today. Let's go. Hello and welcome to a new podcast episode. This is something special. This is a collab with two podcasts. So you are in luck, my friends. My name is Catherine Moore. I am the host of the Social Workers Rise podcast, and I am here with Jake and Kat. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Catherine Roberson. Miranda, I also just got married, keep forgetting that. And Jake and I are with the Clinical Supervision Connection podcast.
Yeah, Jake.
Very nice.
Yeah, excited.
Yeah, we're excited. So we're talking about burnout from a research perspective. So I'm really excited because I believe that this is a really, really big area of need in just in the mental health industry in general. I was looking at some statistics and, I didn't realize that mental health professionals were 1.5 to 2.5 times more likely to develop a stress related or an affective disorder compared to people in other professions. So just doing this work puts you at risk for mental health disorders.
Yeah.
So pretty crazy, but yeah, exactly. So Jake and Kat, let's do our introductions. Tell us who you are.
Great. So my name's Catherine Roberson Miranda. I am a counseling psychologist. I'm currently an assistant professor at Fordham University. And yeah, that's who I am.
Doctoral program, running an internship at Towson University over here in the state of Maryland. Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Excited. I'm Catherine Moore. I'm a licensed clinical social worker based in California, host of the Social Workers Rise podcast, and also founder of the Rise Directory. So I'm really excited for this conversation because, Jake, you have done a lot of research around this area. And let's just start with, what is burnout? Tell us what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's the question of the day here. It's funny, there's not one unified definition of burnout, and I think that's part of the issue that we'll probably talk about today. A lot of the definitions center around emotional exhaustion, feeling unmotivated, feeling disconnected from one's work. Physical illness is also sometimes a definitive and defining factor of burnout. I generally come at burnout through the lens of what's called the conservation of resources theory, which in essence talks about how burnout is a lack of personal resources. And all of the physical symptoms, the exhaustion, the lack of motivation, the lack of being focused, comes from depletion of your kind of energy that you would be able to otherwise give. So it's funny that there's not one centralized definition for burnout, but people use different definitions all the time, which I think is just wild.
Yeah, it's also interesting because I feel like when you say burnout, everybody knows what you mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you say I'm burnt out, I'm like, nope, I got it. I'm with you. I hear you.
And I also wonder too if it's being misused or used too much to where it's almost used interchangeably with I'm just having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's true. A lot of folks, in my experience, are I'm stressed, so I'm burned out. And I think they are distinct and different, or today's been such a day that has caused a lot of stress. But I think that burnout and stress are interchangeable in a lot of fields, and that's not quite true.
Right. Because my understanding is that burnout is when you are just at your max capacity and you have just just don't care. Like you're apathetic, you're irritable all the time, most of the time. You are just at the point where you're just trying to get by and make ends meet. And it almost becomes a way of life. And you don't
Mhm.
even realize that you're in it until somebody points it out to you. And you said, for me, I was like, Psh, no way. I'm just trying to get my job done. But then after some reflection, I said, okay, they're right. I'm probably burnt out. So I don't know if you guys had that similar experience.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to take it even farther, I think it's one of those things where if you're really stressed out, you have a really bad day, okay, you take a weekend, you relax, and you can come back. Burnout doesn't allow you to have that bounce back in the same way, right? When you're burnt out, like, yes, you can take that time, but it doesn't, you never quite feel like you're getting back to your normal. And that's, I think, a really big defining feature, just the persistence of it.
I also think it's important too that people feel burnout, and this might be one of the reasons why there's not a solid definition. People feel burnout so different, right? Even just across cultures, across identities, there are differences in our experience. And it is strange, as you mentioned, like when we talk about burnout, folks go, "Oh yes, I know what you." Um, I'm just kind of like thinking about the contributors and how people end up feeling burned out individually, what those kind of look like.
Yeah, and in the research that I've done, there's so many different contributors to burnout, which again makes it more complicated, right? Like we're talking about toxic workplaces, poor
Hmm.
professional boundaries, poor personal boundaries, but even unrealistic workloads. So it's not always, our fault. It could be just the environment that we're in, just having emotional exhaustion, a lack of work life balance, and or having poor social supports. All of these things, contribute to professional burnout. And that's not even touching on personal burnout, but
Mm,
just having all of these things in place, it almost creates the perfect storm. Like the more factors that you have, the higher your risk of burning out, from what
mm.
I've seen. And I'm wondering, Jake, what's the research landscape regarding burnout for clinicians?
For clinicians specifically, it's interesting because we know one pretty definitive uh, piece of evidence that's been repeated throughout, and that's that burnout occurs more often in clinicians than it does for other professions, right? The research is pretty clear in terms of the higher statistical likelihood that people in our fields helping professions will be more burned out than, say, other professions. Um, the causes, like you were mentioning, are not quite as clear, and they differ across a lot of the different identities and particular like differences in our fields. Like I can imagine there are differences in the work that you do as a social worker and in the work that social workers do versus psychologists do and nurses do and mental health counselors. Uh, but I think that one of the defining features is that there's a lack of and a difficulty engaging with empathy and our empathic ways of sitting with clients. And so clients are really impacted and affected by clinicians who are burned out. Um, it's harder to make that connection that clients really need to feel safe and feel supported and feel validated within our line of work. Um, I think that there's also some evidence that points to folks feeling less able to get additional resources from their workplace, right? As you were mentioning, like if we're in a situation where it's not necessarily the clients that are burning us out, instead it's the environment, it's the workplace culture, it's maybe microaggressions that are occurring within the workplace. Those are all contributors to burnout, which make it harder to engage, which make it harder to get support that we're needing, and then it just kind of redoubles and doubles. Um, there are a lot of pieces of smaller research that's point to other factors, but not a lot that's been replicated. And I think that's one of the most wild pieces of this to me is that there aren't a lot of specificity and specific symptoms we can look to and say, okay, yes, that causes burnout. This particular thing. When my supervisor, told me I was going to get a raise and I didn't, I felt more burned out. we don't have a lot of consistent evidence that it's the same across individuals or across samples. It really does depend on an individual's experience, the things that they have going on, both professionally, personally. Uh, and I think we don't talk about that enough, that it really does come down to the individual level.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that because something that I was thinking about this before we came in today, and I was like, all right, I've been burnt out before. What happened? And it was everything that you just listed, but there was also, I think, a piece of, and I'll take ownership of this, but I think it might be more of a cultural issue, especially when you're a student for so long. You get used to, you go to class, and when you go home, you are still responsible for the work, right? You don't leave school at school. You do your work on the weekends, you do it at night, you read in bed before you go to sleep. And then when you transition into a professional world, it's very hard to break that pattern, to say, okay, I left my office and therefore I am done thinking about this. I am not going to respond to emails. I'm not going to respond to phone calls. I'm going to set those boundaries, because we don't actually learn those boundaries as students in this field. And so there's a bit of a transition that I think is required, but it's not necessarily built in anywhere for people to learn it.
Mm.
Right. And culturally speaking, sometimes we just operate in a place of just hustling and working because sometimes we just have no choice.
Mm-hmm.
And it works because we're young, we have this adrenaline, we have this optimism and this hope that things are going to be better after grad school, after college, maybe after you get your license, right? Whatever that next thing is. But eventually there just comes a point in time where it becomes too much. I remember for myself, I felt the same. So you're used to working, I worked 7 days a week in grad school. So once I got out, I said, wow, I got 2 days off. But I was still working more hours and the energy piece too. Right. So just because you have the time to do the assessment or the time to do the notes, it doesn't mean that you always have the energy. And for me, that was the piece that was really hard, is I just kept depleting my energy every single day and starting every day on empty. And it got really hard to the point where I was just in tears and I just couldn't even function anymore.
Yeah. And that,
And I
I
think
mean,
you're speaking.
that's just so, it resonates so much with me because I felt the same way, where I just felt like I have the time to do this. So then I should, because also we're in the helping profession because we care about people, right? We don't want to just leave, feel like we're not supporting people when they need us. And so if I can do it, I will. And then I find that now I don't have energy for myself. But where are we supposed to learn those things? I don't know.
We look to the people in our programs, in our supervision, which is, the area that I focus in, to model. And when it's not modeled effectively, or actually when we're told we should be continuing to work or we should be continuing to push ourselves, which I think is the experience of a lot of folks, we never really are set up to
Mm-hmm.
learn what this looks like. I had a supervisor tell me that there's a really big difference and a really important balance between work ethic and rest ethic. And I'd never heard that term before, rest ethic, but it's really, I've carried that with me and it's really resonated for me, because I think that speaks to what we're trying to combat when it comes to burnout.
What is rest ethic?
It's the idea of how we put so much work into our daily lives, into our working professional lives, into, I have to make sure that I'm being productive. And if we can shift that mindset into, well, resting is productive. Resting allows me to replenish my resources. If I go home and I take an intentional few hours, I was going to say an hour, that's my work ethic, right? To not do my professional work and instead do my personal rest, right? I'm going to go and take a long walk with my dogs. I'm going to go and spend some time doing a hobby with my friends or my wife, right? Those things are rest ethic, and it's intentional time rather than procrastination of, oh, I have that big project coming up that I'm just
Mm-hmm.
going to do this stuff instead because I don't want to work on that yet. And I don't know, my supervisor, who I have not talked to in quite a while, will probably be able to adjust my mentality on that. But that's what I've always understood rest ethic to be.
And that makes sense. And I always tell my clients, I use the analogy of a Tesla, right? It's a great electric car. It goes high performance for whatever, 4 hours, but it needs a recharge every couple hours, every so many miles. It has to just sit and do nothing and recharge. And I say, okay, are we saying that the Tesla's lazy? We're saying it's useless because it's not doing anything? No, it's productive. We're recharging it so we can keep on working it some more. And it's the same for us, right? And even more so because we're humans, we're not machines. So we definitely need a recharge, and our recharging is productive. So I like that term, rest ethic. And it's interesting too, because we're talking about how in grad school, we have this work, work, work ethic, maybe culturally growing up, work, 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 produce. And then we become supervisors. And this is carrying over into clinical supervision. Hey, it's Catherine here. I hope you are enjoying this episode. We're going to take a quick break to listen to these ads from our sponsors. The next time you need continuing education units, I highly recommend the Therapist Development Center. When I started this podcast, I reached out to the founder, Amanda Rowan, to see if she was interested in being a sponsor. And she jumped at the chance to support her fellow social worker. TDC has helped more than 100,000 social workers pass their licensing exam, including myself. I love that TDC CE courses are engaging and relevant. Amanda and her experts give us clear and practical clinical skills that we can immediately apply to our work. Some of my favorites are the Edge of Life Suicide Prevention course, where Amanda shares her personal experiences, and They Did What? Law and Ethics course that looks at real cases where therapists face formal disciplinary actions. They also have a great telehealth course. We are legally required to take continuing education to increase our competence, and most other courses out there don't actually teach the material in a way that we can learn it, but TDC does. You can also check out the links in the show notes. So, Jake, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. How can supervisors protect supervisees from the burnout, or how can we kind of reinvigorate our clinicians to combat burnout?
That's the question of the day as well, right? That's something that we still don't quite know enough about. And I think it comes down to what we just talked about. There are several things that I've been considering in that question. I think a lot of times it comes down to addressing expectations. In what we just spoke about, if I'm coming into supervision with the expectation that I'm going to completely and utterly change my client's life in the first few sessions that I have with them, there's a lot of data that says that clinicians, particularly trainees who are over empathizing and over identifying with client improvement, those are the clinicians and the supervisees who are more likely to be burned out. So we can combat burnout in adjusting expectations. No, change does not happen overnight. Change doesn't even usually happen within 2 or 3 sessions. It's over time. And also change is pretty, it looks different for different people. Sometimes change means we're just planting seeds. Also, promoting professional wellness is a really important aspect of all of this. Again, supervisors are modelers. They model the appropriate professional behavior that we would like to see in ourselves. And so if we see a supervisor who says, hey, sorry, I actually can't make it to supervision today because I'm doing X, Y, and Z, or hey, sorry, I'm, out at this thing and I'll try to reschedule later, we're teaching our trainees and our supervisees that it is more valuable to be out being whatever productive means than it is to be attending to not just ourselves, but to actually one another. If your supervisor is not showing up for supervision, I don't know if this is necessarily supported by the research, but I can imagine it's inadequate supervision. and it might be leading to more burnout.
Yeah, which makes sense because part of the research is that you have a social support, you have that connection, you feel part of a community at work. And if that community is missing, then you don't have that person to call up and say, "Hey, I had the wildest experience with this client. Can I just vent? This was just, never experienced it
Mm-hmm.
before. What would you do?" Just that camaraderie and the people to be able to talk to about it and to vent to. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel a whole heck of a lot better after I'm able to vent for a good 10, 15 minutes and, kind of get it off out of my head.
Oh, 100%. And I think also, like, going back to that workplace culture, then your supervisor has to be available for you to give them a call and say, "Hey, can I vent to you for 10 minutes?" They can't be booked back to back also, right? And so having that be a full culture where no one is being kind of drawn to their limits, and then being present when you're supposed to be present for sure, but then also taking the time when you need to as well. So when I had a supervisor tell me that they couldn't um do an extra activity that I was asked to do because that they had to attend to their child's like performance. It was some type of event that their child was having. It was like, oh, yeah, those things are important too. And like that gave me permission for when something was happening in my family to kind of recognize that I need to take that time for myself as well. That work is not everything. So there's that modeling, but then there's the full blown cultural aspect of you need to be able to access people, which means that they need to be free. And you need to feel like you can take some time and you're not going to be judged for that. You're not going to be thought of as being lazy. And I love the Tesla description too, because I
Yeah.
usually use a jug and a cup where I tell my clients that you can't fill someone else's cup if yours isn't full. You have to fill yours first. And it's much easier said than done. I think all therapists have some form of this analogy that we use with our clients, but how often are we really doing it ourselves? And then how often are our supervisors telling us to do it?
And
And I say,
that's
Jake just gave me a point.
yeah, that's the answer to invigoration, I believe. Right? It is how can we model to our supervisees and to our clients even that no, it's important to take this time, right? What can we do very intentionally within supervision or within our clinical work to invigorate us right now, to give us back energy and those resources that right now. This is not just a place where we emotionally expend and think about all the work that needs to be done. It's okay, well, what did you do that you're really proud of this week? What was a clinical win that you can carry with you and that at the end of the day you can go home and say, yes, I did that? I don't think, at least in my experience, I've had that quite enough. And I hope that's not the case for many people and many trainees, but I think that it probably is.
And that's a great point. I love to ask my supervisees that question, what win did you have this week? Because so many times we can just get stuck in the rut of just seeing client after client after client, and we talk about problem after problem after problem, and we lose those feel good stories and those emotions and that hope and the evidence that we are making a difference, right? Kat, you mentioned we're in here to help people. So let's hear stories about our colleagues helping other people, and let's be able to acknowledge and celebrate that we are helping our clients as well. And I wonder, is that one way that we can help people get kind of unstuck, right? Or
That was
prevent
going
them
to be
from
my
feeling,
question.
yeah, from feeling stuck in the
Yeah.
first place? Because that's just seems to be a common word that I hear come up when people are feeling burnt out, that they just feel stuck and they don't know how to get out of it. So I don't know. What do you guys think about feeling stuck and ways to get out of it?
I mean, I think I'll always go back, and it's such a buzzword now, but self-care. Like, I hate when I hear it come out of my own mouth because I feel like everyone says it, but, like, that doesn't mean being like, "Okay, you have to do a meditation on your way home," or you have to go to the gym because you said you would. It's whatever you need for you, protecting that time. And I find sometimes it's easy to say, "Okay, I'm not gonna do anything on that day," but then what are you going to do? Because vegging out is not the opposite end. So what do you wanna do? How can you protect that time and treat it as just as important as you would a client session. You wouldn't tell your client, oh, I can't do this just because. So don't tell yourself that. And how do we encourage that in trainees?
Agree. I think I would agree wholeheartedly. And I also am resonating with the idea of promoting, once again, rest ethic. And also acknowledging that self-care doesn't, I have to tell this to clients a lot, and it boggles the mind. Self-care isn't, oh, you went to bed and got 5 hours of sleep instead of 3 hours of sleep. That's not self-care. That is actually the bottom line of care, right? You're getting enough sleep. You're engaging enough in your hygiene. You're eating and drinking water, and you're taking care of yourself in those ways. That's not self-care. If we're doing those things, we've now hit the minimum requirements for living as a human being. Everything else that comes after that, that's what self-care means. And I don't know, Catherine, what's your experience with getting unstuck?
I
Same.
think,
So, oh,
sorry,
sorry.
I forget we're both Catherine now. I was
No,
like, I just spoke.
I know it's funny because I'm Catherine, and then Jake, your last name is Moore. My last name's
Yes.
Moore. So we both, have the same names in some way. Uh, yeah, no, it's interesting because I say the same thing when I talk to social workers. We don't have a basic job, right? A basic job might just be something, I don't know, automatic. You don't really have to think about it. But our job involves trauma and pain and emotions and being there, giving of our energy to people. And so that is not a basic job. So basic self-care is not going to work. And like you said, Jake, those things are the things that we just need to do to be alive. And that is not what I would consider self-care. And I like to take it a step further and say, what's going to be your soul care? What does your soul need today to be well, to feel joy, to feel at peace? And it can vary for everybody on different days. It varies for me every day, right? I just try to have that self-awareness and say, okay, how am I really feeling today? What is it that I need? And what is it that's realistic for me to do given the time that I have? And do I need to be making more time to dedicate to myself? And that can be, on a spectrum of things, right? Addressing physical health, my mental health, my mood, my social connections, spirituality, just being in nature, right? So all of these things that are not, and I hate, how they say self-care. I see self-care pictures at the mall and I cringe because they're like,
Yes.
buy this new facial thing and do your self-care. And I'm like, no, it doesn't take $300 and a facial to do self-care. Like, you could just go out and sit under a tree and that could be your
Yes.
self-care.
I went and
Exactly.
I went to the park and got an ice cream cone and just sat there for 30 minutes. And I was like, oh, this is nice. That was my self care. And it lasted me like a good day or two. I was like, this is great. And maybe that's the bottom of the barrel that I just admitted that it lasted so long, but still.
No, I think the smaller moments that can last a long time. I played guitar for the first time for 30 minutes a few weeks ago, and it had a lasting impact. I think it is the smaller moments where we make a choice for ourselves that really do make a difference in the long run.
Yeah. And I know we're talking about self care, but the opposite of that, I think, in some of the research that I know Jake has been involved in is vigor. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because I don't think that word's used too often outside of the research
Yeah, it's
space.
not something that's often talked about. And I think that vigor is kind of, there's a difference between theoretical and practical, right? But in our profession as mental health advocates and helpers and professionals, we view often burnout and vigor as two opposite ends of the spectrum, where burnout is that depletion of resources, vigor is the accumulation and the surplus of resources, where we have energy, where we feel like our work is rewarding, where we are getting what we're hoping to get out of it. We're seeing results. We're excited about coming into work. Maybe not every day, but maybe more days than not, right? Um, and I think that we're all striving to feel invigorated, but I do also want to stress that those two things are often not necessarily opposites, that I can feel invigorated by work I'm doing with clients, but burned out by a relationship that I have at work. I can feel invigorated by the groups that I'm running, and burned out by the administration at the place that I'm at. Those things are allowed to exist at the same time. And so the issue is that when we're burned out, it's harder to actually make contact with the areas of our work that feel invigorating. Um, it's still, young research, but it is something to emphasize and to keep in mind as we're making contact in our various workspaces.
Yeah,
makes
it's
total
interesting.
sense.
You're right. I don't really hear the word vigor discussed when we're talking about burnout. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I'm just wondering, where do we go from here? What's next? Because we all know this is a problem. We know this is a very common problem, and it has its impacts on not only, our mental health, but organizations. They're going to more care about how it increases our absenteeism, how it affects client services, how it impacts our ability to do the work, to do accurate and safe work, right? So where do we go from here? What do you think needs to happen? If we could wave our magic wand, what do you think needs to happen for this to no longer be a problem in the mental health industry?
I need a very big wand.
Yeah.
So I think I have multiple levels. I think at the largest level, there needs to be a pullback from focusing on making money in some businesses where there is a desire to have as many clients as you can fit in one day, for each person, so that we can build in some of that like breath between working with people, whether it's to take a second and regroup before you see someone else, or to celebrate a small win you just had with a client. Either way, I think if we move up from there or down, I guess, supervisors being able to model. I think we talked a lot about that today, what that looks like, to not be burnt out, to take care of yourself, to be happy about those little wins, share it, ask your supervisees about those things. And then also to look out for supervisees as well. Are you seeing signs that people are starting to maybe not care as much? Are they becoming kind of apathetic to their clients, or engaging in some compassion fatigue? Is there like an increase in absenteeism or lateness that maybe is indicative of something larger happening? So we can start looking out for the trainees before it feels like it becomes their norm as well.
You hit the nail on the head for what I've been thinking as well. There's an aspect of this that speaks to the idea that I don't know that we can influence a burnout free environment or profession. I think burnout, maybe we can shift ourselves into thinking that actually burnout is expected
Mm.
in some regards, and we have to be more diligent and mindful of looking after ourselves and one another, right? Um, Kat, you almost immediately spoke to systems that we inhabit. And I don't know that we can do things individually against the system, but maybe we can do things within our systems that we engage with immediately. That supervisors who have supervisees that are feeling burned out, it's okay to check in and say, hey, how can we use this time today? We don't have to always spend it reviewing clients and making sure that everyone's okay. If your clients are good, how do we take care of them? And maybe this is strange, but I think that is okay for folks to do within their faculty settings, within their clinical settings. We're allowed to take care of each other. We're actually really good at that as our professions, right? And in the fields that we inhabit. So it boggles the mind that we don't do it for each other. And maybe it's because we're burned out. I don't know. But burnout is expected, and maybe we can just look to the people that we're working with and wonder, how are you doing? And follow through on asking.
I'm
Yeah,
curious,
and
Catherine, your ideas.
I like both of your thoughts. And what I was thinking is a culture shift and a culture change, which needs to happen, which is essentially what you guys were talking about, is how do we have this trauma informed perspective, assume everyone has trauma, right? What if we just assumed everyone was burnt out and checked in on them and said, what are you doing to help yourself to be well? and to really normalize and prioritize it, just like we do eating lunch, right? Hey, what are you doing for lunch today? Like, what are you doing to make sure you're well or feeling good or feeling joy or feeling peace, whatever it is that you need. But what if we were able to normalize it to that extent to where it's like, yeah, I'm having a burrito and then I'm going to yoga after. I don't know if that's a really good combination.
I would like it.
I don't know if you should eat burritos before yoga.
Maybe flip those. Yeah.
Two of my favorite things, but not together.
Then it sounds like a great.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And and this conversation is part of that culture shift, because I know that supervisors listen, social workers listen, mental health professionals listen. And so I hope that somebody today will take away that, hey, burnout happens, but here are some things that can reduce it and to make sure that I just don't get so stuck. That's what I would like to see.
Agreed. And feel invigorated in our work.
Yeah. To feel like the work we're doing is not only taking from us, but giving to us too, right?
For sure. For sure. So that is our conversation today. Did we cover everything?
I think the only thing left is, where do we get more information for people? I know for us, we have the Clinical Supervision Research Collaborative. That is a agency that our podcast is based out of. We are the Clinical Supervision Connection podcast. And then, Jake, you probably know some researchers in the burnout world that might be useful for people to look up.
It's weird to think that I'm one of them. So that's a place to, if you have questions, certainly email me. There are a lot of researchers in clinical supervision that would be able to answer this question. Rod Goodyear's one of them. Michael Ellis is another. Diane Borders. There's a lot of folks who are part of that Clinical Supervision Research Collaborative that are great mentors of ours, Kat, and also great fountains of knowledge that will be able to provide more information.
Great. And for me, the podcast Social Workers Rise, we're really focused on career development for social workers and mental health professionals. I found coming out of grad school that there was just a huge gap of support. In grad school, there was just a plethora of support and resources. And then once you get into the field, it's like, well, I hope your workplace supports you. Otherwise, you're kind of on your own. And I was just thirsty for those mentors and these types of conversations from people who have been in the field. So that is what the Social Workers Rise podcast does, is it's really supporting those that are early on in their careers or just looking to see what else is out there and what can we do, with our mental health degrees, and how can we make an impact and make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. And you have a resource list, correct?
I do. Well, yeah, my email list, and I send out all sorts of different trainings and courses and tips and cheat sheets. So I can put the link in the show notes for the Social Workers Rise podcast and that. And also, make sure that you're subscribed to both of the podcasts, because there's so many great resources and information available.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much, guys. We'll talk to you later.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Social Workers Rise. If you love this episode, be sure to subscribe and text this episode to a friend. If you want more, there are a few ways we can get to know each other and work together. First, definitely subscribe to the Friday resource email list. The link is in the show notes. And that's where you can learn more about the courses I offer, including Clinical Essentials for the Future Therapist and the Pulse Basics for Medical Social Workers. I'll also be sending out occasional tips and resources and other happenings within the social work industry. And for all your clinical supervision needs, be sure to visit risedirectory.com. This is a national directory of clinical supervisors for social workers and we also provide free resources that you can use within your own clinical supervision. Lastly, if you have more individualized needs, I do offer coaching, individual consultations, and am available for public speaking engagements for social workers and change makers. Lastly, the boring legal stuff, but very important. The information in this podcast is not meant to be a supplement for therapy, professional advice, or clinical supervision. This content is provided as is solely for informational purposes. It is not legal, health, or safety advice. I am not advising you as a therapist. Organizations should engage their own experts to ensure any adopted measures are compliant with applicable laws and standards in their jurisdictions. The opinions expressed by individuals or organizations are their own and do not reflect the views or opinions of Social Workers Rise or Catherine Moore. References to specific products or organizations do not constitute any endorsement or recommendations by Social Workers Rise.